Greetings and hello to everyone. This is the Business of Betting podcast, and I'm your host, Jake Williams. Today is episode 4, and we have Adam Chernoff joining the podcast. Adam started his foray into the betting world, spending a decade in the Caribbean and Central America regions in places like Trinidad and Tobago, the Dominican Republic and Columbia. Adam takes us back to what it was like in that part of the world, and how betting and bookmaking has changed over the last 15 years. Adam currently lives in Canada, and we discuss the current betting environment in North America, as well as what positive changes could help augment the US betting culture. As always, you can find us at businessofbetting.com or at bettingpod on Twitter. Please fire in any questions or feedback and future guests you would like to hear from. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy my chat with Adam Chernoff. Today, I'm joined by Adam Chernoff. Adam, thank you very much for coming on and spending some time having a chat.
Happy to be here, Jake. It's nice to be on the other side of the microphone for the other time and answering some questions instead of asking them.
Yeah, I know you've delved into this area a little bit, so we might touch on that later. But first, to get us started, there's obviously going to be some people in Australia and different parts of the world who might be listening. So do you want to just take us through some of the background on how it all started for you and what led to where you are now?
Sure. I started betting on sports about 10 years ago, back in 2007, and I began posting online. It was really the first time I came across sports betting, and the forum era was just kind of reaching its hot point, and so I got involved with that, and I just sort of carried through with it through my younger years. After graduating in high school, I moved out to the Dominican Republic, and I took a few $1,000s with me that I'd saved up. I was working at a concrete company over the summer after I graduated high school, and I just went to the Dominican Republic, and I said, let's see how long I can last. I didn't really realize that the country was so full of bookmakers. It's the most bookmakers per capita on earth. There's about 16,000 legal bookmakers, and God knows how many else that are illegal on the island, which is a fairly small island, all things considered. So basically, anywhere you go, you can get down and place a bet. I didn't realize that going in. And so it just kind of became my natural way to keep myself afloat. And I was just sort of betting on sports myself, spending the day on the beach during the day, hanging out, made a lot of good friends living down there. And then I ended up betting at night. And then in 2011, right at the end of 2010, early 2011, I just happened to connect with the right people, and I met up with a man named Richard Williams, who owns CGS International, which was bought out by Maya a few years ago. Maya was a big gaming company, but that's a different story. But at the time, they had a number of different casinos throughout the Caribbean, and he was starting up a bookmaking operation sort of as a test run in Trinidad and Tobago. And so I ended up really hitting it off with him, and he's sort of a big gambler himself, so he took a chance on me for whatever reason, sent me down to Trinidad and Tobago. I spent a few months in Port of Spain before that eventually fell under. Returned back to the Dominican Republic and got hooked up with a couple of guys from the Bahamas. Turned out that they were extremely influential people. Whether they did so above the law or below is sort of up to the discretion of the listener, but I ended up working for Assure Win and Paradise Games, which are the two biggest gaming companies in the Bahamas next to Island Luck, and I was running their sportsbook operation. I ended up getting picked up by Chances a year into that, and I carried through providing odds, setting numbers, moving the markets, managing the risk for all three websites, and I carried through doing that until 2015. Which is when I met my wife, which changed my life pretty dramatically. And we spent the last couple of years in Colombia. I was living in Medellin, Colombia. A lot of people know that city for the wrong reasons, but I absolutely love my time there. And just recently we moved back to Canada, and my wife is going through the immigration process to become a resident here.
Wow, that's a bit of a whirlwind. Was that, over sounds like about 10, sort of 15 years. That was all.
Yeah, we're sort of at just over the 10-year mark.
Wow. Okay. So you mentioned a lot of very interesting things there. I guess the first one I want to touch on, you mentioned you're betting on sports and spending time on the beach. A lot of people from the outside probably think that betting on sports is easy and you can spend all day drinking Coronas and then at night you can place a few bets and win a whole bunch of money and sit in the hammock all day. I'm sure it's not really like that. Is that the case?
I guess at the time I was fairly young and dumb. I was about 18 years old at the time. So I definitely thought it was a lot easier than it was. A lot of, I guess, my initial success came off luck, and it definitely kept me afloat a little bit longer. But I was quick to learn that these places were all independently operated. And when you have so many independently operated places, there's obviously opportunities that pop up between them in terms of how they move their lines, how quickly they move their prices. So I became a little more privy to, I sort of learned on the fly, I guess is a good way to put it, at how to sort of really grind out a living day to day. But the key word is definitely becomes grind when you're talking about doing this for a living.
So were you often betting both sides of the board because you had so many bookmakers and I would imagine so many different opportunities to bet both sides? If there was a discrepancy in the lines and there was some value to be betting both sides?
There was definitely some buyback and some selling that I was doing, but mostly it was just getting the best of a number in a big way. You learn which places move first. You learn to learn who moved the places or who moved the numbers at each places. And I mean, when you're talking about where I was, you're thinking a street that's, say, a kilometer or two long, and along there's 6 or 7 different places that are all owned by different operators. So, I mean, it just became a matter of going to each place, sort of down the line and seeing the best number you can get and going back and forth, because they could never move it quick enough to keep up with the other guys, just because the infrastructure wasn't there and the technology at the time was definitely lacking.
So take us to that part of the world. You mentioned there might be a street full of bookmakers. Are they all operating on advanced sort of technology systems that help them with their betting, and there's sophisticated sort of algorithms and databases full of information that they're using, or is it a lot more old school when you're living there and you're consuming the different odds from different bookmakers? Is it what we would expect, or is it much more advanced?
Well, everyone listening to this in Australia and UK has to realize that they are, I'd say, at least a decade ahead of the rest of the world. So this was in 2010. So, I mean, what they were doing in 2010 is what was sort of going on and even it might be tough to compare to what was going on in the UK and Australia in, say, the turn of the year 2000, 2001, just because it's so far behind. I mean, these places were just a few hundred square feet at the most when you go in. I guess square meters for anyone listening, you're talking 40, 50 square meters, just like the size of a kitchen, bathroom type of thing. One lady behind the desk, she's got a computer which is hooked up to their main odds system. Whether that's controlled by a single person or an odds service is to be determined. They have a thermal printer, and you walk up and they have all the odds written down on a whiteboard or a chalkboard, and they change them sort of as they go if they're not lazy enough to get up from behind the counter, at which point you're going up to the counter saying, I want this price, and that price has been gone forever, but they just haven't changed it. So, I mean, it's pretty archaic in terms of certainly what's there today, but even what was there 5-6 years ago in the Australia and UK.
So did you ever get worried one day you would walk down to collect a winning bet and then there would be nothing there?
It definitely crossed my mind to start. I came to realize that pretty quick it's not in their interest to do so, just because the competition is so heavy. You get the one bad sort of payout, and especially if it happens to someone who's not from there, who has I mean, being at the time living in the country, if you're foreign, you sort of have a little more leeway with what you're able to get away with in terms of the gaming and the liquor laws. So, I mean, the last thing that any of these little places had in their mind was to screw someone over a few $100.
So you mentioned you're on the bookmaking side as well as the betting side. Take us into a normal day on the bookmaking side for you back in the Dominican Republic or even Medellin when you were working there.
Yeah, so my first bookmaking job was working with Richard at CGS, and I was at Palms Members Club in Trinidad and Tobago. Casino gambling wasn't technically legal. It was a very gray area at the time. There were a couple casinos that operated, which were very big corporations and connected through the government, but everything else was run through private members clubs. And so what that meant was basically they were all massive houses, but they would clear everything out of the houses and they would put whatever you want inside. So in order to go into one of these places, you had to sign up at the door and register and become a member. And then once you're inside these places, the laws didn't apply. So we'd be catering to these private members, and inside of these gambling houses, I guess you could call it, were very upscale bars, gaming tables, slot machines, cigars, pretty well whatever you wanted. And Richard had the idea to throw sports betting into there. So at the time, it was 2010. And again, you're in a third world country. We didn't have the infrastructure that nearly is available today. I was operating on two different computers, laptops. We had the whiteboards up on the wall where I was changing the odds as they come in. We had a few TVs, and we had a little bit of a setup in the corner behind the blackjack and the roulette tables. And basically, I'd get there early in the morning, put up the numbers for the day if they weren't already up from days prior. I was there right December, January, February, so it was right during NBA season, so it was sort of a day-by-day process. But I'd have to put up the numbers, and we were open for about 14 to 15 hours a day, and it was just handling the foot traffic as it came in.
So who were the clients, and what was the customer acquisition like back in 2010? Was it a combination of people off the street, word of mouth, or was there an online sort of business at all?
Definitely nothing online. We couldn't go advertising outside of the members clubs. Advertising away from them was illegal. And it was part of the reason that operation didn't succeed. Definitely as I got into a sure win in Paradise Games later on in the Bahamas, was a much more sophisticated online system. But in Trinidad and Tobago, it was extremely hard to get customers just playing, just because the culture there is so different, and it's a very cricket heavy country, and cricket, while it applies itself well to trading and everything like that in the UK and Australia, it's become very popular. There people were much more interested in playing, and there wasn't that big TV presence, so it was very difficult to get customers. And it's been tried a couple times to get bookmaking started there, and every operation has failed for the most part.
So in some of these clubs, did you have tourists coming in on holidays, coming in to come in and watch a game and have a bet or play some casino games, or was it just the local population?
It was pretty limited to locals. Port of Spain at the time was pretty rough. There was a lot of crime, a lot of trafficking of you name it going through there. So it was difficult to get those tourists away from the hotels, away from sort of the safe zones into these areas at night.
So what sports were you putting up on the board and were people betting on back in 2010 there?
That was basically NBA. I was there for the 3 months, but as I got into a sure win in Paradise Games in the Bahamas with my next job the year later, we were doing full American sports, and we had the massive audience for that exceeded my expectations at every level.
Okay, and then I would imagine it was much the same on the betting side. Were there any, or were there a lot of sort of professionals there, or was it very much a public and casual sort of clientele?
For sure. This, I guess, switching into the Bahamas, it shocked me at first because I didn't expect, from going there and setting everything up and seeing how they run. It was a similar members club situation, but they were more of the web shop model where rather than having the physical games, you would go in and they would have the computers. Everything was online. I was shocked at how much people bet on sports and how, I guess, I want to call it sharp, but just how intelligent and quick they were to adapt with everything that we were offering them. Like they were quick to jump on lines. They were quick to take the best prices. And it was a challenge to manage the risk and balance the books at the end of the day, because it really caught me off guard for the first while.
So was that some type of agent system where other people were instructing people to go and bet in those areas because there was the possibility to bet, or was it just a sophisticated local population?
Well, the Bahamas was an interesting situation because up until recently, it was illegal for the locals to play at any of the casinos because the casinos were all attached to hotels. So you hear about like Atlantis, which is a popular one. They have a massive casino. They have a huge sports book. But none of the locals were able to go in and play at the casino and play at the sports book because it was all reserved for tourists. So the owners of these gambling websites were able to really take advantage of a market that was starved for gambling. And so I think that sort of fueled a lot of the players and just the amount of play that was coming in. And then, of course, you have a lot of people on that island with a lot of money to spend. So that definitely didn't hurt us either.
Okay. So how did you get your sort of background and basis knowledge for the betting and the bookmaking side? I know you mentioned you left after you went to high school. Did you learn on the fly everything, or was there some way you accumulated knowledge, whether it's the mathematics side or even just the sports side?
Much of the numbers stuff I picked up in my couple years prior betting. I wasn't good at going to school, but when I was at school, I was good at learning. I was not the ideal student, but when I was there, I was quick to pick things up. And so I was always pretty good with numbers, and I managed to catch on to the odds and the game theory of betting very quickly. And over 3 years, it just got stronger. So I was never slow to catch on to any of that, but just as far as how to manage the money, how to manage the staff, how to manage the risk, how to move the numbers, how to balance everything, that was all on the fly. I learned a lot of it just in my first couple months while I was in Trinidad and Tobago, but moving over to the Bahamas where I was using software, I used DGS odds making software. I was quick to pick that up, and that made a lot of things a lot easier to manage, but also it really opened my eyes to just how many things there are to run the backside of a sports book.
So did you delve into any other areas other than sports? Did you have any history with poker? Obviously, poker sort of had a boom back in those days. Were you delving into poker as well, or any other sort of betting or bookmaking?
I initially started playing poker. I was never better than a great break-even player, but the first thing that really got me into gambling altogether was seeing the tournaments and everything on TV. The Score app is a very popular app for bettors and people watching American sports, but a lot of people don't know that was a television network in Canada, and they carried a lot of the poker content that was on TV for Canada. So that's sort of what hooked me into gambling. So got me familiar with odds and sort of got my feet wet, and then I ended up transitioning into sports betting a little bit after. But aside from poker and sports, I've never been much for playing slots or tables or anything else like that.
So are you full-time betting now in Canada?
Interesting enough, you mentioned that. I just made a post today on Twitter that for the first time in over 10 years, I'm stepping back from betting day to day just because of all the other things I have going on in my life. I just recently took on a new position at a large casino corporation here in Canada, and it's, I guess, my first legitimate job that I've ever had. And I say legitimate because anyone else I've worked for has been sort of on the other side of the law, to put it nicely. And then my wife's going through the immigration process as well. After living in Colombia for a couple of years, we decided to come to Canada just to have a better chance at a future, I guess, for her. So we're going through that process now as well. And I wasn't able to keep up at the rate that I wanted to, just being as competitive as I am and having sort of the background I do. I know what level and how much time has to be spent in order to be successful. And to put in that level of work, I was just sacrificing a little bit too much of family time. So just recently in this last sort of week, I've made the decision sort of to step back from the day-to-day betting. But a lot of what I'm doing now is focusing on providing content and creating material just based on what I've learned over the last 9 or 10 years, which I'm hoping to be able to share with a lot of people through social media and sort of build my following with that.
Will you continue to bet on a part-time basis then?
I said I can never step away from betting. It's something that once you get into it to the level that I've got into it, you can't step away from it because you see. I mean, even when I've tried to take breaks, I'm sitting there and I see the opportunities come across, and I can't help myself from looking at the markets. But just as far as making the day-to-day grind of it, I'm not going to. But those spot bets, they have to come up because no matter where you go, you can't get away from those.
What are going to be the biggest challenges then? Because I would imagine, are you going to focus on a certain sport or a certain conference or a certain team or things like that? Or are you just going to wait and see for positions or situations where you know it's probably going to be a positive expectation value bet based on all your experience and just fire in those situations?
I'm very big into South American soccer, and I'll say football because I know we have the international listeners. I really fell in love with the game while I was living in Colombia. The 3 years I spent there, it was just too hard to avoid. And I find those markets are really lacking the attention that other major football markets forget. And there's always a ton of situations that pop up there. Just knowing the situations that arise and still talking to the people that I talk to on a daily or next to daily basis. So, I mean, that's always sort of my main area of focus. But then, of course, with so much media attention on the American sports and being sort of in the heart of that, being in Canada, it's hard to ignore certain situations as they come up, just knowing that what's going on in the media is going to present a different situation in the market that's going to be too good to pass up on.
So South American football, what percentage of your bets would be in play as opposed to pregame?
I'd say about 75% pre-match to 25% in play. And the reason for that being is on Betfair, the liquidity is definitely not there. So you have to go over to somewhere like a Bet365 in order to get the coverage on all the matches that's needed. And they're so quick to limit anybody who has any success in play that you really have to sort of pick and choose your spots on when you want to make it worthwhile. I've got the accounts in the wife's name and stuff like that to sort of try to get by them. But they're becoming pretty good at flagging their players and shutting down accounts quickly when you're having that success. So I try to sort of stay away from in play as much as I can unless I know I really want to make that spot count, just to avoid the risks of being limited and shut down so quickly.
What is your overall betting strategy then? Obviously, it's probably findings and selecting value and betting based on that. But are you looking at situations, or are you looking at sort of deep dive into some of the data and some of the players and how they perform in certain circumstances? What is, the overarching sort of principles that you use without sort of going too deep and giving away any IP?
Sure. A lot of what I do is just finding sort of inefficiencies in the market. There's definitely, when you compare all the odds on the board, there's a massive discrepancy in which sportsbooks think which team should be priced where. And they're pretty easy to spot when you know the teams and you know how these books move their prices. So, I mean, just from watching your odds page, you can see a lot of moves as they happen, and you can see which sports books they originate at, and you can sort of follow the money through to tell if it's a good move or a bad move. As far as looking through the players, when it comes to like a domestic league in Colombia, for example, you have sort of your top tier of players that make a difference, and then after that, it's sort of 70% of the league gets junked into is it really worth more or less if they're in the lineup? So I think a lot of people do focus on who is playing and who is not. But when it comes to these smaller domestic leagues, you can really sort of waste your time and waste a lot of effort looking into which players are specifically in, because the chances are that replacement coming in has just as good of a chance to be as impactful as the normal starter is. So I tend to focus more on the markets and which moves are the true moves and which ones aren't, and just make my way around the market trying to get the best of the number.
Okay, so I'm sure you've encountered a lot of bettors on the bookmaking side and obviously colleagues when you are on the betting side. Are there more than one or two ways to go about winning? Have you found that some people don't watch games, don't watch replays, and are purely diving into some of the the data or some of the market sort of analysis, or people are just following the players individually and reading every article they can about their personal lives to see if they've got a sick daughter and therefore it might impact performance? Have you found that there are long-term ways to win more than just going into watching the game, selecting the value, and placing those bets?
I think there's a lot of ways to get to the same point, but at the end of the day, you're only going to win if you're getting out in front of the market. I think that the process varies greatly from bettor to bettor, and not every person uses the same methods to get to the answer, I guess is a good way to put it. But as far as there being more than one way, if you're not beating the market, you're not going to be successful.
So how do you go about splitting up the selecting teams and finding the value, and then obviously executing the bets? Do you treat them as two separate, strategies, or do you have separate strategies for those, and do you split them up, or are you just going in with the mindset that it's all one, action?
I think that, a lot of what I've done over the last couple of years is just sort of finding more efficient ways to bet. I think the betting process for most people is a lot more extensive than it needs to be. And so I used to do when I was working on the bookmaking side, I had to do the power ratings. I had to do the team by team. I had to do everything and break everything down to its furthest point. But now on the betting side, just knowing as much as I do, or I don't want to say knowing, that's a bad way to put it, but being as familiar as I am with markets and how they move, I sort of let that guide me to where I should be looking. If you're going to look at a weekend of 10 games in, say, this Colombian domestic league, Liga Águila, there's going to be a couple moves right away that point out which games you can influence and which games you can get out ahead of, and that'll save you from looking at the other 6 or 7. So I'm sort of at the point now where I'm just looking to be as efficient as I can, and the easiest way for me to do that is to let the market tell me where to look first, and then I sort of work backwards from there going through the game. So I let those pointed out for me.
And when we're talking about staking, what is the optimal staking plan, for you? Is it the larger the edge or the perceived edge, the larger you bet, or are you betting similar amounts on all of your bets regardless?
No, when the edge is there, you've got to make it count. That's the one way you make the most of it. And you got to be maximizing your positions when you know you have the best of it. I think there is reason behind the flat staking. I think most people who do favor the flat staking, they've got more to worry about than their stake amount. And I think a lot of that comes down to just their mental game not being as strong. If you have to limit yourself on how much you can bet, then it may be more of a control problem, in my opinion, than is it, because if you think about this logically, the best way is maximizing, and it always will be.
What about on the technology side then? You mentioned you used DGS in the past. Now you're living in Canada, previously, in the Dominican and places like that. Have you seen a major has there been major advancements on the technology side that helps you be a better essentially, or is it much the same as it was?
Unfortunately, in this side of the world, there's a couple companies that sort of control it with their odds movement software, and they tend to charge a lot of money for it. So a lot of bettors are really limited from the options that they have. And you go over to like UK or Australia, where there are those options to sort of get your feet in the door for free and improve on it. There's a lot more opportunity over there than there is here. Over the last couple of years, to be honest, in terms of tools that bettors can use to improve themselves and become better at betting, it's really stayed the same. And it has been the same for a number of years. DGS software, which powers some of the most popular American-facing sportsbooks, it was written Windows XP, which, when did that go out? 2001, and it's still got the same look. It's still got the same template. It's still got the same feel to what it was when it was created 15, 16 years ago. So, that's still holding true to today. And some of the biggest sportsbook companies that are facing the U.S. are relying on that software every day. So that really gives you a good picture to how things are still stuck way behind over here in this part of the world.
Okay, so how then, I guess now we're in an information age where there is a wealth of data and a wealth of information readily available for bookmakers and bettors and anyone else, whether it's casual or professional. So how do you, I guess, consume that? Or what works for you on accessing all of this information, and how is it best utilized in what you do?
It's become easier than ever to find out information, but more difficult than ever to apply it. And I think we're reaching a fairly complex problem where it's becoming a very big challenge just to absorb all the information that we can and realize what's good and what's not, and stay away from that noise like you mentioned. And it's sort of interesting to see how people deal with it, because a new concept will come up and people will be very quick to adapt to that or that mindset, and it'll become like the hot thing, and it'll just spread through everything so quickly just because everyone's so in touch. And any sort of information is going to come out, whether it be injuries or anything along that line. And it's really interesting to see how little or how much some of these pieces of information that come out impact the market. But I think that the best way to handle it, to answer your question, is to really study or get a good feel of how certain information impacts a market and whether it's impacted it too much or too little, and find those spots where something will come out, and use all this information to your advantage. When you get that notice for an injury or whatever it may be, look to see how that impacts the market and if this has moved too much or moved too little. And you'll be amazed if you start paying attention to this stuff and sort of getting a measurement on it, how often you can tell if a price has moved too far or hasn't moved enough, and you can just get an opportunity from that. But of course, the challenge with everything is really just sort of avoiding all of the junk that comes at you on a daily basis.
Interesting. So you mentioned Bettor earlier on the bookmaking side, and I guess you've obviously got this part of the world, Nevada, with a lot of bookmakers there, corporate bookmakers as we would call them. In your mind, what is the future for some of those corporate bookmakers, as well as the Betfairs and the matchbooks of the world? Do you think it seems to be recently anyway that it's going down the path of limiting action, limiting turnover for a lot of professionals and smart bettors, and working on more of a profit margin model as opposed to a high turnover model? Is that what you're seeing in the industry? It's going down that path. Obviously, you've got the pinnacles of the world, but sort of in general, is it headed that way?
Well, eventually we get to the point where Denise Coates just takes over everyone and runs the world herself through Bet365, no?
You might be right.
No, I mean, it's weird because it's almost come to, I guess for these corporate bookmakers, they almost have like a competition problem where the market, especially in like the UK, has become so saturated with different options and different names that they're sort of forced to merge together to take advantage of the markets. Otherwise, they're all going to sort of eat themselves from the inside out. But I mean, I don't know who is going to end up as the main one. But I mean, in this day and age, there's no reason for your best option or your easiest option to be offering you markets that are priced with 7 and 8% margins applied into them. So I think there's definitely going to be a place for whoever is willing to take the chance and drop their margins down considerably to take over that big portion of the traffic that's really becoming upset and enraged with these bookmakers. And I'm amazed at how much content comes through on social media or the internet on a daily basis with people who are smart enough in the UK to realize what's going on here. And just the overall hatred that some of these people have for bookmakers is really sort of spreading for the positive. And I think that eventually someone is going to have to take a stand and drop their margins down considerably, and they're going to get a lot of traffic from it. So I think that's going to be sort of the first thing that's got to happen if they're willing to do it. And then I guess the second thing is going to be, how do they innovate? We haven't really seen any sort of innovation in the betting process in 60, 70 years. I mean, it's gone online and away from behind the counter. But I mean, as far as how do you innovate a sports market or a sports betting platform, it's a difficult thing to do because you can't really dress up two teams playing each other in the odds like you could with, say, the slot machines, which have evolved so greatly, or even table games now. You look at roulette. Scientific Games just released a thing where there's a button on the table and now people are spinning the ball on the roulette wheel and all their bets are automatic and there's no dealers and everything's becoming so advanced. You look at sports betting and it's really stayed the same. I don't think in play like it was naturally going to happen, but I mean, you can't make that any better than it is. Without some sort of network deal where it's built into the game itself and it's showing on your screen. So, I mean, I don't know what the next big innovation is going to be. Maybe it's something like Bookie with a guy I know, Adam Kalmanson. He made it, and that's sort of taking advantage of the technology that we use today and the mindset of the younger bettors. But that innovation challenge is going to be the big thing that they're going to have to deal with in the future for sure.
Interesting. Yeah, I definitely agree. As well as, I mean, the US sports certainly are analytics heavy, I would say, opposed to other sports around the world. You see sort of baseball, for example, and I don't think there's any peers with regards to some of the information and statistics and StatCast and all of that sort of stuff that you can find within the baseball realm. So I guess my question is how is it going to go, certainly for the US, to bring the sort of population up to speed on the betting knowledge? Because I find here, certainly in the US, that it's certainly lacking. There is good information out there, but it certainly is stifled, and with the industry sort of stagnated, it's hard to get that widespread information out to everyone where it's fully understood. Do you think that is a problem for the US going forward, especially when it comes to innovation? Because if you don't have that base betting knowledge, it's very difficult to innovate based on entering a new market, and I'm sure it's very difficult for the regular person to just jump straight into the stocks and bonds market and start innovating there without the deep knowledge. So do you think that is something that will stifle innovation going forward?
I don't think that the U.S. has the innovation problem yet. The U.S. has a culture problem, and I don't know how that's going to be solved. There's a very small portion of the country which thinks it's much bigger than it is, that thinks that all of these teams moving to Las Vegas is going to suddenly change how the rest of the country views betting. The problem is so ingrained into the culture that gambling is associated to something illegal, and that's the first thing that the country has to come over collectively before they're even able to start thinking about improvements in technology and innovating that and becoming, even in the same sentence, as close to being on par with the rest of the world. There's such an uphill battle. And thankfully, there are some people that are optimistic because it has to happen. But even you go into Las Vegas and apps for betting are a new thing. Like, they've only been around for a year or two at some of the major places. And you think about places like Bet365, which were offering in-play betting on a computer a dozen years ago, and that still doesn't exist in the United States because the market isn't big enough for it. And people don't even know that the in-play exists because they can't even access these websites from their computer because it's all blocked. There's that whole other world of in-play betting and everything that's become mainstream in the UK and Australia that hasn't even been explored in the slightest. And I'm talking with people in betting groups that I'm in, and there are people saying, oh my God, I love live betting. I just tried it. And these are great bettors that make a lot of money doing this, and they're just doing it for the first time now. So, I mean, that whole side of it is so far down the road, it's not even close to being in thoughts of I mean, my mind for one, but it should be in many others. But solving that culture problem is going to be a big hurdle to get over. And, I mean, you're going to need a whole lot of great education to be able to overcome that.
So the apps in Las Vegas, that's always fascinated me, because when I've been there, I've seen the apps. You can download them. They're not fantastic apps, certainly.
Like, they look terrible.
Right, they're not great. But putting that aside, what is the reason it's taken so long? Is it the volume, which you mentioned? They just can't get that volume to make it worthwhile? And also, the geo-blocking as well is obviously a problem. You can access a lot of different websites from the US. You can't place bets, you can't deposit money and those type of things, but from an information and content standpoint, Is there a reason why they aren't putting out different information and content? Is that going back to the culture thing you mentioned?
I don't know if it's a lack of will from the people looking to improve themselves or just a lack of simply knowledge from people able to provide it. You look at how far behind the country is in terms of the rest of the world, which we keep going back to that comparison. But I mean, you try to make that comparison, and there's no one to offer any new content, because it seems like anyone who's very good at betting in the country has hit the ceiling on what they can know, and then they just lean on that. Once you sort of get to that point when you have your connections in place and you have what you want to know, there's no desire to get better, because there's no other options to bet on. There's nothing else to expand into. There's no secondary markets that you can take advantage of. It's the pre-match betting, and that's that. So I definitely don't think that helps. As far as the apps in Las Vegas, not living there, I can't be like the main source to comment on it. Obviously, you've seen how bad they are, so have I. I think one of the biggest problems they have is once you leave or cross state lines, those apps are no longer accessible. So, I mean, you have the small local population that uses them, and I think that that's attractive to sports books. And I'm sure the volume is increasing on these apps. It has to be. But I mean, you have the people who come in. Las Vegas, obviously a huge tourist destination. They're there for the few days. They're likely staying at the hotel or the property that they're betting at to begin with. So they're going to make the most of it, because you have to remember that this isn't available anywhere else in the country. So when you go there, you're sort of going there to be able to experience it. So the reason, obviously, they can't take it back home with them, but I think people are reluctant to use it because they'd rather be sitting in the sports book watching the game, betting on it with the ticket in their hand, an experience they can't have anywhere else in the country, rather than just going in on their phone like they do the rest of the time they're not in Las Vegas betting illegally online.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one. We could talk about it for hours, but I'm interested. You released some stock suggestions I've seen. Is that a side project or a passion project of yours, or is it something you legitimately use to generate other sources of income?
Well, I've never been involved with the stock market. I've always lived abroad. I've never been. I've had a checking account, and that's about the most in-depth my banking history has gone. I really started getting into sort of the psychology of betting, reading different books. I got into books like The Value Investor, which is the one that Warren Buffett famously recommends. I've got into some behavior economical books as well. And a lot of those always relate back to the stock market. And then just naturally through doing some trading on Betfair, playing the tennis markets, I sort of got the concept of the stock market itself. And so everything sort of came together in the last few months, and I said, wow, I've got sort of the knowledge on how everything works from the reading that I've done. I know a lot of these people that work at these gaming companies. I know the products they have. I deal with them often. I know what a company can be worth. I know how to analyze the balance sheet, and I figured I'd take a couple cracks at it, and the two I came up with were Amaya. I'm very familiar with David Bazoff and that whole operation through my first boss, Richard Williams, who was part of the company. So I'm very familiar with how that company runs and where it can go. Of course, they own PokerStars. And then the other one I suggested was Every. Amaya's up a few percent since I posted it, and Every's already more than doubled. So far it's done pretty well for me. I don't know if it's something I'm going to get into heavier, but it definitely was an eye-opener for me when I started going through a few months ago and looking at the prices of these companies and just knowing what I did about them. These two definitely jumped off the board to me, but there's another one I'm looking at, Pollard Banknote, which is a small company. Wow, I shouldn't say small. It's worth a few $100 million, but it's located in Manitoba here in Canada, and they provide print lottery tickets, and they make the coating that covers like the scratch-off tickets. And they just signed and will be signing a few more deals with companies and governments in the States, as all the governments in the United States for each state are really happy about their lottery and happy to promote that, unlike sports betting. But so there's a couple deals that they have coming up that could bump their stock price up. Right now it's about $10.50 Canadian, so could see that go up to about 14, 15 by the end of the year.
So where do you get your content from? Do you have any suggestions for the listeners who might want to have access to some, free premium content? I know you've started to release some yourself. Is there any sites or any destinations you rely on to get some of your betting content or even just in-depth sports content?
As far as you're talking scores and odds, or just people that I look into and listen to, or?
Yeah, both, because it seems to be, let's just say, limited compared to other places, having access and trying to find good quality content. And we might even touch on gambling Twitter in this part of the world after this question, but where do you rely on to get, or what sources do you rely on to get your information?
As far as betting, when I'm betting the domestic league in Colombia, I have a lot of people I've worked with that I'm in touch with, but and I suggest it for any soccer league. Even if you've never used any of this type, just get started with something like Odds Portal or Odds Checker, just so you can get sort of the full picture of the market in your head. I think a lot of people will deposit at a bookmaker or two, and they'll get sort of stuck on those two. And they look at what happens within those two ones they play at, or however many they play at, and they don't look at the market as a whole. If you go on these free odds comparison websites, you can see the margins. You can see how bookmakers move. You can see which ones are moving first. So I would suggest for anyone just to go to one of those websites and use it often, just so you can look at everything from a different perspective. As far as like podcasts I like to listen to, this one's going to be going up on my list. I've listened to your first two episodes. They were great. So that's a plug for you.
Appreciate it.
I like Chat with Traders, which is another one from Australia. If you've heard of it, I'm not sure, but they have they've done about 115 episodes now, and they bring on different types of stock traders, bettors, everything, and they talk about a lot about just the psychology of betting and gambling or investing, and as well as some technical stuff, which is really good to listen to. A lot of books. I'm currently reading a couple different ones. I'm doing Nudge by Richard Thaler, which is a behavioral economics book. Lots of really interesting stuff just about how we think when we're betting into the markets. Anything by him. There's another one, Misbehaving, another really good one if you're going to recommend books to people reading. The Checklist Manifesto, another book that I really liked. If you go and you put those three into a suggested list on Amazon, you're going to get a whole bunch of different ones that'll come up. But anything in the behavioral economics side is really good for any bettor, just to sort of get an idea of how you think about different prices, because that's really all we're dealing with all day long.
Interesting. Yeah, there's some good, Misbehaving is a great one. Some of the Talib books, Anti-Fragile and Fooled by Randomness, those type of books, and even Gladwell.
Those are hard reads, though. I'm all for backing the content that's in them, but you got to really focus to get through those.
Absolutely. No doubt about that. I appreciate your time. I'm cognizant not to keep you too long. But before you go, I'm just curious, gambling Twitter in the US, it's a tough, very tough area of the world to get involved with. There's a lot of tough stories and bad stories. There's a lot of touts and things like that going on. I'm curious, has it always been that way, and do you think it'll get any better, or is it just you've got to really strap in if you're going to head into that part of the world?
Well, this is a fun topic, and it's what I've been involved with for when I first started posting in 2007. It was on the forums. And there were a couple of big posting forums. And when I say big, I'm talking thousands of people going a day. There was one in the UK that was really good, Punters Lounge or Punters, something along those lines. It was really good for soccer that I used to go to a lot. But there's never a comparison to this. But a lot of people, as forums died and social media came in around 2010, 2011, everyone sort of shifted over. And I guess what happened sort of was these stories and everything bad that used to happen used to be spread out across like 5 or 6 places. So you would go to a place and you would get friendly with people and you'd figure out who was sharp and who was square. And then there'd be these discussions about this person and this incident that happened. And it would sort of be isolated to that one spot. Now with Twitter, everything's all in one spot. So you have all of the good, and then you have all of the bad piled on top of each other, and it's sort of a competition to see whether the good or bad rises to the top. And more oftentimes than not, it's the bad stuff that gets driven to the top. So if you are listening and you're in the UK or in Australia, there's definitely a lot of very good content that you can look through and find when you're looking for someone based there. But I guess you just have to be wary of the bad stuff that's on there as well.
So how do you extract the value from the content that's out there? Do you subscribe to lists or things like that on Twitter where you can have certain people that you value, or do you just have to take the good with the bad?
I've actually just created a list. There's 16 people on it right now, and it's 16 people who I think who are influential in my day-to-day betting, people that I'll look for to see who they have, who they're looking at, or what their comments are on certain games. So I've really started getting into the lists, and if you're listening and you want to get into that, then it's definitely a strategy I would suggest, rather than just sort of the mass following. Find the people who present value to you, add those people on a list, and you can avoid a lot of the junk. It doesn't take long to see who gets it and who doesn't, especially in this part of the world where, like I said, that ceiling for knowledge is so low. So I think anyone coming over from the UK or Australia, where that ceiling is so much higher, is going to be pretty quick to catch on to who knows what they're talking about and who doesn't. Okay.
Before we go, you have anything exciting on the horizon? You mentioned that you've got the new job and obviously your wife moving to Canada and going through that process. Will that keep you occupied going forward, or have you got anything else to share?
Yeah, that's sort of keeping the most of my life a little bit busy, but I am excited to finally be publishing content. I recently stumbled across Medium, which is an awesome app for anyone publishing or anyone who writes. It lets you sort of create the content the way you want to see it in a very easy way to do it. WordPress it can get a little technical, but this keeps everything the same and clean. So I really like that tool, and I've used it to produce a couple articles so far. I'm definitely going to be doing a lot more. I'm going to try to do 1 or 2 a week going forward, just on going in depth with different betting strategies, how bookmakers work, the psychology of betting, all sorts of stuff like that, just that I've picked up over the last decade or so. So I'm happy to finally be able to share that with everyone, and hopefully encourage a lot of good conversation and discussion, and bring some education to it, and as well get back a lot from the people who are reading it and commenting as well.
We certainly look forward to having access and reading to that content, no doubt about that. Adam, thank you very much for coming on. Thank you for your time. Really, really appreciate it. Some great insights there, and look forward to chatting again soon.
No, but thanks for having me, and look forward to listening to more of your episodes as they come up.